There are maps that were never meant to be found. Not because they were lost, but because someone at some point made a deliberate choice to fold them away, press them between the pages of a ledger no one would ever read again, and trust that the ground they described would keep its own secrets long enough for everyone who mattered to die. The map in question was drawn sometime around 1847. It depicts a plantation in the low country of South Carolina, a few miles inland from the Combahee River, on land that had been cultivated for rice since the early 1700s. The plantation was called Harrow Hill, not for any hill because there are no hills there. The land is flat and wet and older than anything built upon it, but for the man who first broke the ground. A man named Elias Harrow, who arrived from Beaufort County with a deed, a crew of enslaved people, and a plan that, by most accounts of the era, was considered routine. The map was drawn by a land surveyor named Gideon Poe, who was hired in the spring of that year to document the full extent of Harrow Hill's physical structures for the purpose of insurance valuation. He arrived in April, did his work over the course of 3 weeks, and delivered his finished drawing to the plantation's owner. His invoice was paid. His name appeared in no further record connected to Harrow Hill. But what he drew, and what he apparently saw, would not surface publicly until the estate was liquidated more than 30 years later, and when the new owner's attorney finally unrolled that map and compared it against the physical structures standing on the property, he found something that no surveyor, no lawyer, no architect could easily explain. There were rooms on that map that did not exist, not rooms that had been demolished, not rooms that had burned or collapsed. Rooms that, by every physical measurement of the main house, had never been there at all. Rooms that were not built, but rooms that, according to at least 3 other people who lived and worked on that property during those years, were very much in use. Before we continue with the story of Harrow Hill and the map that should have never been unrolled, if you're new here, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment right now telling us what state or city you're listening from. We have listeners from all over the country, and we'd love to know where you are tonight. As Sombras do Pasado. To understand what Gideon Poe drew, you first have to understand the world he walked into when he arrived at Harrow Hill in April of 1847. The low country of South Carolina in the mid-19th century was a place of extraordinary, contradictory beauty. The marshes stretched for miles in every direction, thick with cordgrass and the smell of salt and mud baking under a sun that turned everything slow and heavy by mid-morning. The rice fields, some of the most productive in the American South, were geometric and deliberate, cut through with irrigation channels and floodgates, and the kind of precision that required decades of specialized knowledge to maintain. That knowledge, it was widely known at the time, had come almost entirely from enslaved people brought from West Africa, from the rice-growing regions of Sierra Leone and Senegal, whose understanding of tidal flooding and soil preparation was so specific, so irreplaceable, that plantation owners depended on it absolutely, even as they refused to credit it openly. Harrow Hill, by the spring of 1847, had been in operation for roughly 60 years. It had passed through 2 generations of the Harrow family, and its current owner was a man named Cornelius Harrow, the grandson of the original Elias. He was 44 years old that April, a moderately prosperous planter by the standards of the day. Not wealthy enough to be notable, not poor enough to be precarious. He kept around 80 enslaved people on the property, a number that had remained relatively stable for the previous decade. His wife, Lavinia, was a woman 10 years his junior from a family in Georgetown. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, Agnes and Clara, and a son, Thomas, who was 15 at the time. They lived in the main house, a large 2-story structure of cypress and heart pine, with a wide piazza running along the south face and a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway. There was a smokehouse, a barn, a storehouse, a small office building where Cornelius kept his accounts, and the row of cabins that housed the enslaved community along the eastern edge of the property. On paper, it looked like every other plantation of its size and era, documented, catalogued, and ordinary. Gideon Poe arrived by flatboat, having come down the Combahee with a boatman who knew the river crossings. He was 40 years old, a trained surveyor who had been working the low country for 15 years, documenting property lines for estate settlements, boundary disputes and, increasingly as the decade wore on, insurance assessments. Lloyd's of London had begun extending fire insurance to American plantation structures, and the underwriters required precise documentation of what they were insuring. It was straightforward work, well compensated, and Poe was considered one of the more reliable men for it. He kept a working journal, not a diary, nothing personal, nothing that would suggest he was the kind of man who reflected on his experiences at length. But he was methodical, and he recorded measurements, observations, and notes about conditions in the way a professional would. Those journals, 14 of them covering the years 1833 through 1852, were preserved by his family after his death in 1869 and eventually donated to the South Carolina Historical Society, where they sat largely unread for decades before a researcher named Francis Hollowell came across them in 1921 while working on an entirely different project. It was Hollowell who first noticed the discrepancy. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. When Poe arrived at Harrow Hill on April 9, 1847, he was met by Cornelius Harrow himself, who walked him around the property that afternoon, pointing out each structure and explaining its purpose. By Poe's account in his journal, the meeting was courteous, but somewhat curt. Harrow was not a man who enjoyed the presence of outsiders. He answered questions precisely and offered no additional information. He introduced Poe to the overseer, a man named Reuben Stokes, and indicated that Stokes would be available to assist with measurements where necessary. Poe began his work the following morning. The first week went without incident. He measured the main house, the kitchen, the smokehouse, the barn, and the storehouse. He paced the distances between structures, noted the construction materials and approximate age, sketched the footprints of each building in his working papers. He was thorough, insurance work required it, and he was experienced enough to move efficiently. The second week is where things began to diverge from routine. On the morning of April 18th, Poe wrote the following in his journal. Resumed measurement of the main house east wall today. Found the physical measurement from the northeast corner to the piazza post to be 62 feet and 4 inches. This does not correspond to my interior measurements, which taken from the main corridor produce a total of 49 feet at best, even allowing for the thickness of the exterior walls. I have checked my figures 3 times. The discrepancy stands at approximately 11 feet. I will re-enter the interior tomorrow with fresh eyes. He did. The following day's entry. Interior measurements confirmed. Total corridor and room width on the east face of the house accounts for no more than 51 feet. Exterior measurement is 62 feet 4 inches. I have walked the interior twice and can identify no error. There is either a void space of approximately 11 feet within the east face of this structure, or my exterior measurement is incorrect. I cannot find reason to believe the latter. 11 feet. In a house without a basement, in a house Poe had entered, moved through and mapped room by room, there was a space, somewhere inside the walls, for which there was no door, no window, no access point visible to the eye. He did not immediately conclude anything dramatic. He was a practical man. Walls could contain spaces for a number of legitimate reasons. Chimney masses, structural supports, passages that had been sealed during renovation. He noted the discrepancy and continued his work, intending to ask Harrow about it at an appropriate moment. That moment came 3 days later. Poe's account is short but telling. Asked Harrow about east wall irregularity this evening. He told me I had made an error in measurement. I had not. He told me older houses often contained dead spaces for structural reasons. I agreed this was true. He offered nothing further and changed the subject. I noted that Stokes, who was present, did not look at me during this exchange. What Gideon Poe ultimately produced, the finished inked drawing delivered to Cornelius Harrow at the end of April, was a document of careful professionalism. It showed the plantation grounds in full, with each structure labeled and measured, each distance between buildings accurately noted, the floodgates and irrigation channels sketched in their correct positions along the rice fields. But in the main house drawing, the detailed floor plan that insurance underwriters required, Poe did something unusual. He drew what the measurements told him was there. Not what he could see, not what anyone had shown him. He drew the walls as he had measured them from the outside, and within those walls, beside the rooms he had entered and documented, he drew a second space, a void space, unlabeled, enclosed by 4 lines with no door and no window, sitting alongside the east corridor of the house like a shadow of itself. He did not name it. He did not describe it in any annotation on the map. He simply drew it, in the same careful ink as everything else, because his training and his honesty would not allow him to pretend that 11 feet of interior space had simply ceased to exist. Whether Cornelius Harrow noticed it immediately or noticed it later is not known. What is known is that he paid the invoice without comment, received the map, and, as far as anyone could later determine, never filed it with the insurance company. The underwriter's records from that period, which do survive in partial form in the Lloyd's archive, contain no documentation for Harrow Hill. He paid for a survey that he apparently had no intention of submitting, which raises a question that would not be asked for another 30 years. If the survey was never submitted, why commission it at all? The answer, when it finally emerged, was more disturbing than anyone who first encountered the question might have anticipated. But that answer required one more layer to become visible, and that layer came not from the map itself, but from the people who had lived within those walls. To understand them, you need to understand a name. The name is Henry. Not Henry Harrow. Not anyone with a surname at all. Not in the documents, not in the census, not in any record that was officially kept, because the official records of the antebellum South did not record the full names of enslaved people with any consistency, and sometimes not at all. But Henry was a man of approximately 35 years of age in 1847, and he had lived on Harrow Hill for as long as he could remember. He had been brought there as a child, and he had grown into a man who was, by all accounts, trusted enough by Cornelius Harrow to serve as a kind of liaison between the planter and the enslaved community, a role that carried its own terrible weight, its own impossible negotiations, its own daily cost. Henry knew things about Harrow Hill that Gideon Poe did not, and he would, in time, tell some of them, but not yet. Not in 1847, because in 1847 Henry was still on that property, and the walls of that house still stood, and whatever was inside them was still there. The story of how we know what Henry knew begins in 1878, more than 30 years after Poe delivered his map. It begins with the death of Cornelius Harrow at the age of 75 and the complicated, contentious settlement of his estate. Cornelius Harrow died on the 14th of March, 1878, at Harrow Hill, in the same house where he had spent most of his life. By that point, the plantation was a shadow of what it had been. The Civil War had reached the low country of South Carolina in 1861 with a particular ferocity. The Union Navy had shelled Beaufort, and the Sea Islands had been seized, and the enslaved people on dozens of plantations had walked off the land before the first year of the war was out. Harrow Hill itself had been partially occupied by Union forces in 1864. Cornelius, then in his 60s, had withdrawn to Columbia with Lavinia and whatever household effects could be transported. The rice fields were never productive again after that. By 1870, with rice cultivation requiring a labor system that no longer existed, Harrow Hill had shifted to a patchwork of tenant farming and neglect, and the main house, once the center of a going enterprise, had become a large, expensive, and increasingly decayed burden. Cornelius's son Thomas, who had been 15 in 1847, had died in the war at Cold Harbor in June of 1864. His daughters Agnes and Clara had both married and moved away to Georgia and to North Carolina, respectively. There were no direct male heirs in residence. The estate, when it was finally settled, went primarily to Clara's husband, a man named Warren Drury, who had no interest in low country land and no sentiment about the house. He put it up for sale almost immediately. His attorney, a Charleston man named Oliver Senn, was tasked with assembling the documentation necessary for the transaction. Deed, title history, structural records, whatever was available. It was Senn who, going through a cedar chest retrieved from Cornelius's old office building, found the rolled survey map with Gideon Poe's name and the date, April 1847, on its outer sleeve. He unrolled it, expecting a standard property survey. What he found instead was that detailed floor plan of the main house, and the unlabeled enclosed space on the east side that Poe had drawn with such quiet precision. Senn was an experienced attorney. He did not panic. He did not conclude anything supernatural or alarming. He walked out to the main house, which was in poor but standing condition, brought a measuring tape, and spent an hour confirming what he already suspected, that the exterior east wall was longer than the interior rooms it enclosed by approximately 11 feet. He then did what any sensible professional would do. He brought in a carpenter to open the wall. What they found there, in a space that had been sealed, as best as could be determined, from the original construction of the house, or perhaps during an early renovation, would make its way into a letter that Senn wrote to Warren Drury on September 3, 1879, a letter that Drury apparently kept, and that his descendants eventually donated to a collection at the University of South Carolina some time in the early 1930s. The letter is businesslike. Senn was not a man given to dramatics, but even in his measured, legal language, something in the sentences tightens as he describes what the carpenter found. The space within the east wall was found to measure 11 feet in width by approximately 40 feet in length, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. It was accessible originally, as best we can determine, by means of a panel in the corridor floor, a hatch essentially, with a short wooden stair leading down and then up again into the void space, designed to be concealed by a heavy rug or piece of furniture. No such rug or furniture remained in the house. The hatch itself was sealed with 3 iron bolts from the interior of the void space. It could not have been locked from the outside. Whoever sealed it last was inside when they did so. He continued, "Within the space we found evidence of prolonged habitation. Several wooden pallets laid with old cloth, 3 ceramic jugs, remnants of what appeared to be tallow candles, and 2 small iron hooks fixed into one wall, spaced approximately 2 feet apart, at a height of roughly 5 feet from the floor. The air within was close but not foul. There were no remains of any kind. Whoever had been in that space, and it appears from the condition of the materials that people had been there, and had been there for extended periods, had left before the space was sealed." He then added a note that Senn apparently felt compelled to include, though it fell outside the strict professional scope of his report. "I asked the remaining tenant on the property, an older man of African descent who has lived in one of the east cabins for some years, and who I understand was there during the time of the elder Harrow, whether he could tell me anything about this space. He told me his name was Henry." He paused for a considerable time before speaking, and then he said only, "That room has been there a long time. People used it to stay alive." I pressed him further, and he declined to say more. Henry, the same man who had been 35 years old in 1847, who would have been 65 or 66 years old when Senn spoke to him in 1879, living in the same cabin on the east side of the property, on land that he had never left and that had never fully left him. If this story is already giving you chills, and we've only just begun to peel back what that map was hiding, make sure you like this video right now and leave us your theory in the comments below. What do you think was happening in that room? What do you think Henry knew? Because what comes next changes everything. Henry did not tell Senn everything. He told him one sentence: that room has been there a long time, people used it to stay alive. And then he declined to speak further, and Senn, being a lawyer rather than an investigator, did not press him. But Henry had told other people. He had been telling people in pieces for years, not loudly, not to anyone who might carry the words to a place where they could cause harm to anyone still living, but in the way that knowledge survives inside communities that cannot commit it to paper, in the way that people pass on what matters when they cannot afford to lose it. Henry had spoken. To understand what he had said, and to whom, we have to understand something about the years after the war. When the Union Army came through the Low Country in 1864, and when Cornelius Harrow retreated to Columbia, the enslaved community at Harrow Hill did not simply disperse. Some went north. Some went to the Union-controlled Sea Islands, where freedmen's communities were being established under the Treasury Department's Port Royal experiment. But some stayed. They had nowhere particular to go, or they had people on the land they could not leave, or the land itself was the only home they had ever known. Henry was among those who stayed. After the war, after emancipation, after the chaos of Reconstruction and the bitter retrenchment of redemption that followed it, those who remained at Harrow Hill lived in a state of provisional occupation, tenants on land that had once worked them, paying renting crops to absentee owners who cared nothing for the place beyond the income it might produce. It was a diminished life, and it was not what freedom was supposed to mean, and everyone knew it. But they had something else too. They had the accumulated knowledge of decades. They had the history of that land in their bodies and their memories in a way that no deed, no survey, no legal document could contain. And one of the things Henry knew, had known for a long time, was the full story of the room inside the east wall. The story did not emerge as a single document, a single testimony. It came out in layers, across time, through several channels, some of which can be traced and some of which cannot. The most significant traceable source is a woman named Delia Pringle, who had been born on Harrow Hill in approximately 1840, who had survived the war, survived Reconstruction, and who, in the early 1900s, was interviewed by a researcher from Hampton University who was traveling through the Low Country, collecting oral histories of formerly enslaved people in South Carolina. That researcher, a woman named Constance Avery, included portions of Delia Pringle's account in a collection that was published in limited form in 1908 and that has been largely forgotten by everyone except a handful of historians. Delia was not speaking of abstract history when she told Constance Avery about the room inside the east wall. She was 63 or 64 years old. She had been 7 or 8 years old in 1847 when Gideon Poe came to measure the house. She did not remember Poe himself, but she remembered what the room was for, because Henry had told her, and because some of what the room was for had happened in her own childhood, within her own memory, even if she had only understood it fully later. The room, she told Avery, was not built by Cornelius Harrow. It was built by his grandfather, Elias Harrow, around 1790, at a time when the plantation was still being developed and the main house was being constructed in phases. Elias had designed it deliberately, a concealed space inside the east wall, accessible only through the hatch in the corridor floor, large enough to hold perhaps 6 to 8 people in close conditions, sealed from the inside. It was, from the beginning, a hiding place, but not the kind you might first imagine. Elias Harrow, and this is the detail that Delia said Henry had told her was the origin of everything, was not hiding people from outside threats. He was hiding people from himself. Or more precisely, he was hiding people from the consequences of a record he was keeping. This requires explanation. Because what Elias Harrow was doing in the late 18th and early 19th century was not, on its face, entirely unusual. But the scale of it, and the particular method he chose, and the extraordinary length to which he went to conceal it, is what makes the room inside the wall something other than a footnote. Elias Harrow, according to the account that had been passed down through Henry to Delia and finally to Constance Avery's notebook, was running a double ledger. In the official records of the plantation, the ones visible to tax assessors, to neighbors, to the circuit court that periodically reviewed slave schedules, there was a certain number of enslaved people at Harrow Hill. That number was accurate to a point. But Elias had, over the course of years, acquired additional people through means that he did not wish to document officially. He had purchased individuals through intermediaries who dealt in enslaved people brought directly from the Atlantic trade that after 1808 was federally illegal in the United States. He had also, in some cases, received people as payment of debts from men who did not want the transaction recorded. These people did not appear in the slave schedules. They did not appear in any official record. They existed on paper, nowhere. And because they existed nowhere on paper, they could not be taxed, could not be inquired after, could not become the basis of any legal trouble. But they also could not, in practical terms, simply live openly alongside the documented population without eventually attracting notice. A stranger in the community, an unfamiliar face to a passing overseer from a neighboring property, a name that didn't appear on the list when the assessor came around. The room was the answer to that problem. When there was any risk of outside scrutiny, when an assessor was scheduled, when a stranger arrived at the property, when the circuit court was in session, certain people were moved into the room under the east wall. They went quietly. They went because they had no choice, and because the alternative, discovery, and the legal complications that would follow for Harrow if his off-books transactions were exposed, was something Harrow would not risk. The room had pallets. The room had jugs of water. The room had candles. It was not a torture chamber. It was a hiding place where human beings were locked from the inside and waited. Delia Pringle was clear on one point that Constance Avery underlined in her notes: the bolts on the inside of the hatch. It was not Harrow who locked the door. The people inside locked it themselves. This was not kindness. This was design. If someone broke into the house and found the hatch, if an abolitionist raider or a federal marshal or anyone with legal authority came looking, the door was locked from within. No one on the outside had imprisoned anyone. The narrative, if challenged, was defensible. The people inside had locked themselves in of their own will. Harrow could not be held responsible for the choices of his workers. It was, as a mechanism of control through the appearance of freedom, one of the more sophisticated things Elias Harrow had ever devised. And it had run, in various forms, under various Harrow men, for nearly 60 years. If Delia Pringle's account was the narrative thread, the documents were the confirmation. Not of everything. Documents rarely confirm everything, especially in a time and place designed to leave certain things unconfirmed. But they confirmed enough. Frances Hollowell, the researcher who had first noticed Poe's journal in the 1920s, spent the better part of a decade cross-referencing what she found there against the South Carolina slave schedules, the tax records of Colleton District, the probate records of 3 successive Harrow estates, and, crucially, the records of the domestic slave trade in Charleston and Beaufort in the period between 1810 and 1850. The slave schedules from federal census records, which enumerated enslaved people by age and sex, but not by name, showed a remarkably stable population at Harrow Hill from 1820 onward. Too stable, Hollowell noted in her working papers. Plantation populations of that era were not stable by nature. They fluctuated with births, deaths, sales, inheritances, and the constant churn of the domestic trade. The number of enslaved people at Harrow Hill barely shifted from decade to decade, which meant one of two things. Either the Harrow family was running an unusually benign, unusually closed operation, with no transfers in or out over 30 years, which was nearly impossible for a working plantation of that size, or the census numbers were not accurate. The latter, Hollowell concluded, was the case. She found in Charleston trade records, incomplete, frustratingly so but present, evidence of at least 7 separate transactions in which men with connections to Elias or Cornelius Harrow had served as intermediaries in purchases that were not reflected in the Harrow plantation records. Some of these transactions were dated before 1808 and were therefore legal at the time. Others were dated after, in years when the Atlantic trade was explicitly illegal, and the paper trails were correspondingly more tortured and indirect. The names on the intermediary documents were not the Harrows themselves. They were factors, agents, men who served as buffers for transactions that their principals preferred not to have in their own handwriting. This was not unique to Harrow Hill. Hollowell was careful to note that in the broader landscape of low-country plantation culture, the acquisition of undocumented enslaved people through informal and illegal channels was not unusual, particularly in the decades immediately following the 1808 Prohibition. What made Harrow Hill distinctive was the room. Because most planters who kept undocumented people did so through the simpler expedient of geographic isolation, putting them in the far fields, keeping them away from roads and visitors, relying on distance and intimidation. Elias Harrow had gone further. He had built a specific architectural solution to the problem of scrutiny. He had designed a house with a lie inside it. And the lie had worked. Worked for 60 years, survived 2 generations of the family, survived a civil war, survived emancipation, survived everything except a careful surveyor and a measuring tape. It was Hollowell who first mapped out the timeline with any rigor, and what she found in that timeline was something that has stayed with anyone who has read her unpublished notes since. The room was used most heavily, she estimated, in 2 specific periods. The first was the late 1830s, during the period when a federal crackdown on the domestic slave trade, a wave of prosecutions and investigations coming out of Washington, had increased scrutiny of plantation records in the coastal South. Multiple Colleton District planters were audited during this period, and several faced legal proceedings, though convictions were rare. It was during this period, Hollowell believed, that the practice of concealment at Harrow Hill was most systematically and most frequently applied. The second was in 1847, the year Gideon Poe arrived to measure the house. Why 1847? This is the question that gives the map its real weight. Gideon Poe was not the only unusual visitor to Harrow Hill that spring. He was the one who left a record because he was a meticulous professional who kept a journal. But he was not the only stranger to arrive in that narrow window of weeks. In April of 1847, a man named Aldous Fenn, a factor based in Charleston, who had handled several of Cornelius Harrow's transactions over the years, died unexpectedly of a fever. He died intestate, meaning with no will, and the administration of his estate fell to the probate court of Charleston District. An estate administrator was appointed, and that administrator began the process of inventorying Fenn's business records. Those records, as it turned out, were extensive. Fenn had been a meticulous bookkeeper, more meticulous perhaps than his clients would have preferred. Among his papers were detailed accounts of numerous transactions stretching back 2 decades, including the intermediary purchases that had connected him to Harrow Hill. Word of this reached Cornelius Harrow at some point in March or early April, possibly through another factor, possibly through a contact in the Charleston legal community. We do not know exactly how, because the communication, if it occurred through formal correspondence, has not survived. What we know is the consequence. In the spring of 1847, Cornelius Harrow suddenly and urgently needed an accurate insurance survey of his property. Not because he wanted to insure it, because he needed to know, with precision, with a professional's documentation, exactly what his property showed on paper and what it did not show. He needed to understand his exposure. He needed a map of his own house as a legal instrument, something he could use to demonstrate, if challenged, what the property contained and what it did not. He did not expect Gideon Poe to notice the 11 feet. This is the most extraordinary detail in the whole story, and it is the one that does not entirely resolve. Cornelius Harrow, who had lived in that house for decades, who had presumably always known about the room, who had ordered the survey specifically to manage his legal risk, did not appear to have anticipated that a skilled surveyor, with a measuring tape and a professional conscience, would notice that the interior of his house was smaller than its exterior. Perhaps he assumed the discrepancy was small enough to pass. Perhaps he assumed that insurance surveyors were less rigorous than he believed. Perhaps, after 60 years of the room existing and no one outside the family ever discovering it, he had simply ceased to think of it as something that could be found. When Poe asked him about the east wall, Harrow told him he had made an error in measurement. Poe had not made an error. When Poe delivered the finished map, with the unlabeled enclosed space drawn clearly within the east wall, Harrow paid the invoice, took the map, and never filed it. What he did next is only partially visible in the record. Within weeks of receiving the map, he is known to have traveled to Charleston twice in quick succession. Visits documented by hotel records that survive in a collection at the Charleston Library Society. The dates place him there in late May, and again in early June of 1847. What business he conducted on those trips is not documented. But there is one other thing from that period that Delia Pringle told Constance Avery. Something she said she had heard from Henry, who had heard it from an older woman, a woman named Ruth, who had been one of the undocumented people at Harrow Hill, who had been in the room many times and who died sometime in the 1860s. Ruth had told Henry that in the late spring of 1847, Cornelius Harrow came to her. Not through an intermediary, not through the overseer. He came himself, which was unusual enough that she remembered it clearly. And he told her, and the others who had been living in that particular shadow, that it was time for things to change, that arrangements would be made, that they would not be in the room again. What those arrangements were, Ruth did not know fully. What Henry had pieced together from other conversations over the years was that Cornelius Harrow had used his Charleston trips to facilitate a transfer, moving certain undocumented people off the Harrow Hill property entirely, through a network of contacts to situations that were difficult to trace. Some of them may have ended up on other plantations. Some may have been sold through informal channels. What happened to Ruth herself? How she came to be in the East Cabin in later years, free and aging on the same land that had consumed her middle years, Henry either did not know or did not say. The room was sealed, bolted from the inside. A door locked by the last person to leave, using the same iron bolts that had always been used to lock it from within, this time with no intention of anyone returning. When Oliver Sens Carpenter opened the east wall in 1879, those bolts were still in their housings, thrown home exactly as they had been left 32 years before. There is a question that threads through the whole of this story and resists easy resolution. What exactly did Gideon Poe know? And what did he do with what he knew? He was not a naive man. He had worked the Low Country for 15 years. He had measured plantations, documented their structures, observed the lives lived within and around them with the detached eye of a professional whose job was accuracy, not commentary. He had seen things. He had understood things in the way that a man working closely with a world understands it even when he has no official investment in its workings. When he drew the enclosed space on the east wall, when he inked those 4 lines representing a room that no one had shown him and no one admitted existed, he was doing something that required a particular kind of courage and a particular kind of restraint simultaneously. He drew it. He did not annotate it. He did not write in his survey notes that he believed the space was being used for purposes that violated federal law. He did not take his findings to any authority. He drew what his measurements told him was there, delivered the map to the man who had hired him, accepted his payment, and left. His journal entry for the last day of his Harrow Hill visit, April 30th, 1847, is one of the shortest in the entire collection. Delivered survey to Harrow, invoice settled. Departed by flatboat at 2 in the afternoon, river high from recent rains, reached Beaufort by dark. That is all. Frances Hollowell, who spent more time with Poe's journals than any other researcher, noted in her working papers something that she called his silence. Not the silence of ignorance. She was convinced he knew or strongly suspected what the discrepancy in the east wall meant, but the silence of a man in a specific time and place who had calculated what could and could not be said, what could and could not be done, and had made a choice that was neither cowardice nor heroism, but something more complicated than both. He drew the room. He put it on the map. He left the evidence where it could be found. He just did not say out loud what it was. In the decades following his Harrow Hill visit, Poe continued his survey work. He mapped properties throughout the Lowcountry and the Midlands of South Carolina. He appears to have lived a quiet, professional life, married with 2 sons, dying at 66 in Beaufort in 1869. His obituary in the Beaufort Gazette described him as a man of careful habits and precise mind, whose work was valued for its exactness. There is no indication that he ever spoke of Harrow Hill to anyone. There is no letter, no conversation recorded, no deathbed confession of any kind. The journal entry from April 30th, 1847, was the last word he wrote on the subject. The map he drew, folded into its sleeve, waited in the cedar chest in Cornelius Harrow's office through 32 years of war and ruin and slow decay, until Oliver Sen unrolled it, and, for the first time, showed it to someone who was prepared to ask the question that Poe had never allowed himself to ask out loud. Frances Hollowell arrived at Harrow Hill, or rather, at the property that had once been Harrow Hill, in the summer of 1922. She was 34 years old. She had been trained as an archivist at the University of South Carolina and had spent the previous 3 years working on a project documenting the physical history of low-country plantation structures, a project funded by a small academic grant that had no particular expectations attached to it and that had given her the freedom to follow whatever threads presented themselves. The thread that had presented itself was Gideon Poe's journal, which she had found in 1921 at the South Carolina Historical Society while looking for something else entirely. She had been searching for survey records related to a rice plantation in Beaufort County when she pulled the wrong box from the shelf and found herself holding the first of Poe's 14 working journals. She read it in an afternoon. She came back the following day and read the others. By the time she was done, she had a single question that she could not put down. What was in the east wall of the house at Harrow Hill? She knew about Oliver Sen's letter by then. It was in the Drury collection at the University of South Carolina, which she had visited in connection with a different property. She had read it without initially connecting it to Poe. Now, going back, the connection was obvious, and she felt the particular embarrassment of a researcher who realizes they have walked past the answer to their question without recognizing it. The answer, of course, was that there had been a room. The carpenter had opened it. Sen's letter described it. The room was there. But the room being there was not, by 1922, a complete surprise to Hollowell. Hidden spaces in antebellum houses were not unknown. There was a small literature on concealed passages and hidden rooms in plantation architecture, mostly in the context of the Underground Railroad, a subject that had received considerable popular attention in the decades after the war. Hollowell's instinct, reading Sen's letter, was initially that the room might be connected to that history, a space used to conceal freedom seekers moving north. It was when she read Delia Pringle's account, which she found through Constance Avery's collection at Hampton University, that she understood she was dealing with something different, something, in a certain sense, more disturbing in its logic than a straightforward act of concealment for benevolent purposes. The room had been built to hide people from official scrutiny so that the man who owned them would not face legal consequences for having acquired them illegally. The people inside the room were not being protected from their owner. They were being protected instrumentally for their owner's benefit. Their concealment served him, not them. Hollowell spent the summer of 1922 on the property. The main house was still standing, barely. It had not been occupied in years. The east wall had been opened and partially repaired after Sen's investigation in 1879, but the repair was rough, and by 1922 the wall had settled and cracked, and the patched section was visible to anyone who looked at it closely. She measured the house. She confirmed Poe's measurements. She brought the map. She had had a copy made from the original, which was still in the Drury collection, and laid it against the physical structure, room by room. Everything matched. The rooms Poe had drawn were the rooms that were there. The enclosed space he had drawn was the space that had been found and opened. The map was, in its entirety, an accurate document of what the house had contained. Hollowell stood in the east corridor, where the hatch had been, and looked at the patch in the floorboards, where the opening had been closed after Sen's investigation. The boards were different, newer, lighter, not yet weathered to the color of the surrounding floor. In 40 years, she thought, they would match and no one would know. She interviewed people in the area. There were not many left with living memory of the antebellum period. It had been 60 years since the war. But she found 2 elderly women in the cabins on the east end of the property. Women who had been born there and who had stayed there through everything, and who could tell her pieces of what Henry and Delia and Ruth had passed on. She recorded what they told her, and then she wrote it up. Not as an academic paper. She tried that first and found that the constraints of academic format did not fit what she had. She wrote it as a long narrative history, 63 pages, carefully sourced, with appendices that included reproductions of relevant documents. She submitted it to 3 academic journals between 1923 and 1926. All 3 declined to publish it. The stated reasons varied. One editor felt the documentation was insufficient for the claims being made. Another found the subject matter of limited general interest. The third, and this is the response that Hollowell apparently found most frustrating, based on a note she wrote in the margin of the rejection letter, which survived with her papers, said that the paper does not rise to the standard of historical proof required for assertions about the conduct of a named individual. Cornelius Harrow was long dead. His children were dead. There was no one living to bring a suit for defamation. The standard of proof required, Hollowell wrote in her margin note, was apparently the standard required to defend against a lawsuit that would never come. She put the paper in a box. The box went into her files. She moved on to other projects, other properties, other threads. She died in 1961 at 73 at her home in Columbia. Her papers were donated to the University of South Carolina by her sister's family. They sat there for 20 years before anyone opened them. The person who opened them was a graduate student named Daniel Yarbrough in the spring of 1983. He was writing a dissertation on plantation architecture in the antebellum South Carolina Low Country, and his advisor had mentioned Hollowell's name in passing as a researcher who had done interesting but little-known work in the field decades earlier. Yarbrough found the box on a Tuesday in March, pulled out the 63-page narrative and read it straight through. Standing in the archive reading room with his coat still on, he recognized immediately what he had. Not just a historical document, though it was that, but a piece of research that had been suppressed, not by conspiracy or official action, but by the ordinary machinery of institutional disinterest. A paper submitted and declined. A box left in a filing room for 57 years. He spent the next year working to confirm what Hollowell had found and extend it where he could. He had advantages she had not. Better access to census records, a growing body of scholarship on the illegal Atlantic slave trade in the post-1808 period, and a changed intellectual climate in which the systematic documentation of the antebellum South's hidden economies, the informal, illegal, and unrecorded transactions that underlaid the official record, had become a recognized and legitimate area of historical inquiry. He also had the Charleston trade records that Hollowell had accessed in partial form. By 1983, a portion of those records had been microfilmed and organized, and Yarbrough was able to identify, with greater precision than she had, the transactions that connected the Harrow network to Charleston factors and their unnamed clients. 7 purchases, as Hollowell had estimated. Over a period of 31 years. Individuals acquired through intermediaries, not listed in slave schedules, not appearing in any Harrow inventory. The transactions themselves were fragmentary and indirect, exactly what you would expect of documentation designed to obscure rather than record. But they were there, and they were traceable, and their absence from the official Harrow records was, in the context of everything else, no longer coincidental. Yarbrough also found something that Hollowell had not. A second journal, not Poe's. A different journal, from a different source. It turned up in the papers of Reuben Stokes. The overseer Cornelius Harrow had introduced to Poe on his first day at the property, whose descendants had kept a small collection of his personal papers. Stokes had kept an overseer's log, a record of daily operations on the plantation, and among the entries for 1847, in the weeks before Poe arrived, there was a note that Yarborough found arresting in its brevity. The entry was dated April 3, 1847, 6 days before Poe's arrival, and it read, "Harrow says the surveyor comes next week. Told me to see to the lower arrangements before that. Said everything should be regular. Lower arrangements. Everything should be regular." Stokes was the overseer. He knew. Whatever the lower arrangements were, and Yarborough had no doubt about what they were, given everything else he knew by that point, Stokes had been the one to carry them out. The people who were not supposed to be seen had been moved into the room under the east wall before Gideon Poe arrived with his measuring tape. They had been in there while Poe walked the house, measuring corridors and rooms, noting the width of windows and the height of ceilings. They had been, in the most immediate and physical sense, inside the walls he was documenting. He had measured around them, and then he had drawn the room where they were. Yarborough published his dissertation in 1985. A version of it incorporating his findings alongside Hollowell's original narrative was published as a journal article in 1988 in a regional history journal out of the College of Charleston. It was well received in the field and cited a number of times in subsequent scholarship on plantation architecture, the illegal slave trade in antebellum South Carolina, and the material culture of concealment in the Low Country. It was not, then or since, widely known outside that field. But the story does not end with Yarborough's article. It does not end exactly. It only finds the place where the record falls quiet, which is not the same thing. What we know about the people who were in that room, the specific individuals, their lives, what became of them, is fragmentary and largely beyond recovery. The nature of their situation was that it was designed to prevent them from being knowable. They did not appear in the census. They did not appear in plantation inventories. They appeared, when they appeared at all, only in the negative spaces of other records. The gap between what the schedules said and what the property physically housed. The discrepancy between interior and exterior, the empty pallets and the ceramic jugs. Ruth, who told Henry what the room was for, died sometime in the 1860s. Henry, who told Delia, died sometime in the 1880s. Yarborough found what he believed was his death record in Colleton County records, listed as an elderly freedman, no surname, cause of death recorded as old age. He was buried on the property. The location of his grave, if it was marked, is no longer known. Delia Pringle, whose account appears in Constance Avery's collection, lived until 1912, dying at approximately 72 years old in the same cabin she had been born in, on the land that had been Harrow Hill. She had outlasted 3 separate owners of the property and every member of the Harrow family. She had outlasted Cornelius Harrow and his daughters and his grandchildren, if he had any. What she felt about the room, whether she thought of it as a terrible secret or a fact of life or something that needed to be told, Constance Avery's notes do not capture in full. She recorded the information Delia gave her with professional efficiency. There is one moment near the end of the transcript where Avery noted that Delia paused for a long time after finishing the account and then said something that Avery wrote down but placed in brackets, as if uncertain how to categorize it. She said, "That house knew. The wood knew. You can't put something like that inside a wall and have the wall not know it. It is not a supernatural claim. It is not evidence of anything except an elderly woman's way of expressing something that did not have a better vocabulary in the language available to her. But it has stayed with every researcher who has encountered the transcript because it points at the thing beneath the thing. At the fact that a building is a record, that what is built into a structure does not disappear when the structure decays, that the measurement of a wall is not only the measurement of wood and plaster, but of everything that was ever decided inside it. Gideon Poe measured the wall. He found the room. He drew it on his map and said nothing else. He put the knowledge where it could survive, in the way that knowledge was preserved when direct speech was not safe. Inside the structure of a document, waiting for someone to look at it carefully enough and ask the right question. Hollowell found the question in 1921 and spent the next 5 years trying to answer it in a language that no one at the time was prepared to hear. Yarbrough found her answer in 1983 and put it into the record where it belongs. The map is in the Drury collection at the University of South Carolina. It is accessible to researchers. The east wall of the house at Harrow Hill has not been standing since at least the 1940s, when the last remnants of the structure were described by a county land survey as in ruin. The land has passed through several owners since Warren Drury put it up for sale in 1879. It has been timber company land, hunting lease land, let to go back to marsh and pine, and the particular deep silence of low country ground that has had 100 years to forget what it was asked to remember. But the map is there. The 4 lines Poe drew, the room that was not supposed to exist, sitting inside the east wall in ink that has barely faded in 175 years. He drew it. He left it there. And the room was real. By the time Francis Hollowell stood in the east corridor of Harrow Hill in the summer of 1922, everything that needed to be found had been found. The evidence was assembled. The story was coherent. The room existed, had been opened, had been described by Sen, had been explained by Delia's account of what Henry had told her, had been confirmed by Poe's measurements. What remained was only the question of what it meant. Not legally. The law had no interest in it by then, and the Harrow family had dispersed entirely after the last surviving member died in the late 1890s. Not in terms of justice, whatever that word could mean across 60 years and a civil war. The people most affected by the room were dead. But historically, what did it mean that a man with a measuring tape had found in the spring of 1847 a space that a family had maintained for 60 years, that had held people who officially did not exist, that had been locked from the inside as a mechanism of deniability? Hollowell wrote in her unpublished paper, "The room was not a dungeon, it was not a torture chamber." The horror of it is more subtle, and for that reason perhaps more difficult to hold in the mind than a simpler outrage would have been. It was a room designed to make certain people invisible, when invisibility served the interests of the man who owned them. It was architecture in service of erasure, and the fact that those who were erased were sometimes the ones who held the bolt, who locked themselves in, who controlled the final mechanism of their own concealment, was not a sign of their agency. It was the completion of a system designed to remove any clear surface on which blame could be located. She was right. And the confirmation of her being right is in the document itself, in the map, in the 4 lines, in the surveyor's precision and the surveyor's silence. Because Poe did what he could. He put the room on the map. He could not open it, could not speak its contents into the official record, could not compel anyone to ask what it was. He was one man with a measuring tape in a world that had very clear ideas about what questions could be asked and what answers could be heard. But he drew the room, and the room was there, and the map survived. There is something in that, in the persistence of a document, in the slow patience of evidence, that resists the comfort of easy conclusions. The room was not discovered by a grand investigation. It was found because a man was careful about his measurements and because he trusted the integrity of his own work more than he trusted the instruction to pretend the numbers added up. He did not annotate the room. He did not label it. He drew 4 lines and moved on. Sometimes that is what it looks like when someone refuses to lie. The map has been in the Drury collection for over a century. Researchers handle it occasionally, usually in connection with studies of plantation architecture or the history of the domestic slave trade. The paper has browned at the edges. The ink, as noted, has barely faded. The east wall of the house at Harrow Hill, the wall that Poe measured twice and found 11 feet longer than the rooms inside it, went back to the ground sometime in the middle of the 20th century. The wood rotted, the plaster fell. The cypress and heart pine that Elias Harrow had milled and raised in the last years of the 18th century eventually surrendered to the marsh air and the slow weight of time, as everything built on that kind of ground eventually does. The room that was inside it is gone, but Poe drew it, and the drawing remains. And somewhere in that drawing, in those 4 careful lines of ink that a surveyor made because his measurements told him the truth and he did not know how to lie, are the outlines of something that happened to real people over the course of 6 decades that was never supposed to be visible. He made it visible, quietly, the only way he could. And that, in the end, is the story of the map that revealed rooms that didn't exist, except they did. What do you think of this story? Leave your comment below. And tell us, do you think Gideon Poe knew exactly what that room was? Was his silence a form of complicity or the only form of witness available to him? We'd love to hear your theory. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves history, the kind that unsettles you precisely because it's real. And we'll see you in the next one.